Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the authors and editors discuss news and events with a splash of history. Our host today is Dan Masterson. Joining him is Jim Dunnigan, well-known military author and the Dean of Wargaming. Also, joining today's show is columnist and author retired Lieutenant Colonel Austin Bay.
Welcome, Austin and Jim. One of the things that's curious to me is how long, now that we've got two wars going, how long the munitions are going to hold out. I read an article somewhere and I can't find it again, but a lot of things are low, right, Jim?
Yes, the United States sent a lot of its reserves that it had in the Pacific to Ukraine because there is a crisis. The problem is both Russia and the West are having problems increasing production. Russia has the infrastructure, but they don't have the raw materials, so to speak. Whoever has more ammunition, more artillery ammunition, has an edge in combat. It gives you a decisive edge when you're defending because you basically can stop an offensive with artillery. An offensive needs a lot of artillery in order to overcome whatever the enemy has, keeping you out of their territory. So the artillery ammunition mess is still there and getting worse. We're talking millions of rounds that are needed. Right now, I think the Ukraine is using anywhere from 300,000 to half a million rounds a month, just to keep in the fight. And reserves to sustain that degree of use are kind of shaky. The Russians aren't much better off. It's somewhat similar to World War I, where both sides ran out of artillery ammunition. It didn't stop the fighting, but it certainly slowed it down. And they eventually caught up, and that's why, our image of World War I is a battlefield, torn up by constant artillery fire. They don't use it like that anymore, but it is a vital component of modern warfare, and everybody's relearning that. And they're relearning that unless it's going to be a short war, which it hardly ever is, you got to have not only a large reserve of ammunition, we're talking millions of rounds of whatever caliber you use, 155 for NATO, 152 for Russia. You have to have production capability. And now the United States is building that capacity, but it basically won't be online until 2 years from now. So, better late than never, because you never know when there'll be another conflict. Again, this is a constant problem. In peacetime, the legislatures, is even in democracies as well as Russia, they can find better things to do with the money than to stockpile lots of ammunition. Another problem is, especially in Russia, is that ammunition has a defined shelf life. In other words, after 15 or 20 years, the ammunition starts to degrade. Now, the Russians don't care about using degraded ammunition. They just warn the crew, say, this stuff is kind of elderly, so stand back. In most cases, the older ammunition simply doesn't go where you intended to go. But hey, it lands somewhere in enemy territory, so it simply reminds it that you're still firing. But it's always a problem maintaining peacetime stockpiles, and I don't think that's going to change. This war will be over, and again, legislatures will say, "Well, we have to maintain those stockpiles," and they get pushed back from the voters, and one thing leads to another, and you're all set for the next emergency with the same problems of supply.
Austin, where are they digging up the extra munitions for this war?
Well, in some ways, Dan, it's robbing Peter to provide Paul with shells, and sometimes you have to go back to Peter. And South Korea provided a lot of 155 millimeter shells to us, supposedly restocking our stocks as we provided, I'm talking about the United States, 155 millimeter rounds to Ukraine. I don't understand we're doing it for the Israelis as well. That's allies that have the same, roughly the same weapons that require the same shells are reached us. Ukraine got rounds, I understand, from Finland. There have been a number of, after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, the Eastern European countries that could join NATO and then finally did join NATO wanted to acquire NATO standard weapons. And that meant moving from a 152 millimeter Soviet Russian type howitzer to a 155 and in some cases a 105 millimeter for your medium artillery. Now, really the 105s are regarded as light artillery. So they had some stocks, which the term is cascading to Ukraine. But overall, our problem is one of expectations. The war you expected isn't the one you got. Now, on the side of Ukraine and the West supporting Ukraine, it's the expectations of the shortage of rounds. The Russians expected to have a 3-week at most war, a blitzkrieg war. So and they didn't get it, and then we've got this curious stalemate where artillery has once again become the king of the battlefield. We had a podcast on that, the return of the god of artillery. Artillery never left, Dan, but you see the why it's such a devastating weapon, and in Ukraine, and because of the improved. Here, Jim was talking about out-of-date munitions. I'll get back to that in a second. But the improved type munitions, extended range, and pinpoint accuracy, whether they're GPS or internal guidance, makes them even the shells even more deadly, and you're not exposing a manned aircraft. And anyway, to get back to the sources, you've got multiple sources, but the thing is, you have to have some sort of coordinating group, and coordination. Some of it's come out of the Pentagon, some of it's been, most of it has come out of NATO to try to have these stocks, identify them, and bring them to Ukraine. But then the question becomes the one that Jim started to answer: how do we replenish our stocks? How does South Korea replenish its stocks? How does Australia replenish its stocks when we're sending it to Ukraine, and the war we all expected wasn't going to be so artillery intense? And you've got to have the industrial base. South Korea does, for its size. It's got a fabulous military industrial base. U.S. has let ours rot, become moribund, and as Jim says, we're spinning it up. I read that we were going to reach the. Actually, I read it on the strategy page. I'm forgetting what the numbers, but we were about half the production we needed to be at earlier this year in 2023, and we won't hit the production number until sometime in the middle of next year. But to replenish the stocks, as Jim said, is going to take sometime in late 2025 to get back to where we now think that to replenish it. But we're going to need more shells if we get into an extended war ourselves, or have to continue to supply our allies who are under attack. And when I said it's the expectations, the war you didn't expect. The current situation with artillery ammo is very much like what happened in the late fall of 1914, with the European powers on the Western Front and also on the Eastern Front suddenly found out that they had expended almost all of their pre-war artillery ammunition, because the rate of fire was far more than quote unquote was expected. And in Great Britain, it led to a political crisis, the shell crisis of 1915. Why were investigation? Why are we so short of ammunition? That's in part because the British Ministry of Defense, they had done their calculations. So French had done their calculations, and even one of the problems of the in some ways a quote unquote good problem is quick firing artillery like the French 75. Just suddenly you could expend tons of ammunition. You weren't firing at the same rates that some of the calculations, pre-war calculations, were based upon. And that's trench warfare, as a result, also the wrong kind of ammunition, because a lot of the planning was that they were going to have fragmentation rounds, shrapnel rounds to take out infantry in the open, and that, as Jim pointed out, becomes trench warfare. They need high explosive that can blow up fortifications. They had to retool in the middle of it. The Germans had their own shortages in 14 and 15, and then heavier another problem in 1960. Now, no, there are real differences. This a century and 10 years can make a huge difference. It has, but nevertheless, there is a historical example of the failure to plan for high munition expenditures, and it took both the Central Powers and the Western on the Western Front. It took about 2 years to fix it, and it looks like it's going to take about 2.5 years to fix it in 2023, 2025.
Another problem is we always underestimate how much ammunition we're going to need, especially artillery ammunition. That was the case, as Austin pointed out, in World War I. In fact, there was another ironic development there. The Allies had developed a lot of these shrapnel rounds, and they discovered after the war, when the Americans were basically testing some of these rounds, one accidentally went off and a bunch of people were standing around, that they didn't hurt people. I mean, they'd hurt, but they wouldn't kill, they wouldn't injure. The shrapnel was overrated, and nobody realized that. I mean, during the war, they said, well, we're using all the munitions we got. It's not enough, so buy more shrapnel and we'll keep firing and keep just bruising these guys, or just not even penetrating anything, and maybe it'll get better. You're always using less than you think you need. But they discovered that, for example, in the 73 war in Israel. We were supplying them with munitions. They had their estimates of what they would need, and they vastly underestimated how much they would need. And we're talking about artillery. Now, this time around, they don't need artillery ammunition. What they need is small diameter bombs, for their attacks on Gaza. And we suddenly started shipping all that in, and the reserves of artillery ammunition we had stored in Israel went straight to Ukraine. So you basically got to be prepared to be flexible and substitute and basically move things around, because it's never going to work out the way you thought it would. I think everybody will learn the lesson in Ukraine that you don't have enough ammunition stored, but they're also going to learn, if they try and fix it, that the politicians, the voters, won't put up with all the money being spent on stockpiling huge quantities of ammunition that are just going to sit there. Now, what the United States, as the Congress, I think, has approved billions of dollars, I think $13-14 billion, to basically upgrade the production capabilities. Now, this is something that will last. I mean, unless you deliberately let it go to crap. But one of the problems was that production capability, as Austin pointed out, takes years, to put in place. The industrial capacity. Well, Congress has basically got religion in that department, and the money's been appropriated, but it's too late for Ukraine. Russia realized the same thing. Now, Russia had a lot of ammunition in reserve, but they really didn't have the capacity to build a lot more. The sanctions that hurt them big time, economically, because a lot of the goods that were sanctioned on the economic sanctions were dual use and were used in creating weapons. So the Russians are basically, ironically, suffering from economic sanctions, impacting their ability to generate, more ammunition supplies, rather than, just sanctions on letting them buy ammunition from anywhere. They bought ammunition from South Korea anyway, and it was a lot of old stuff, but it was still effective. But the North Koreans have basically sent all their older ammunition, and now their factories are working overtime. It's more employment for North Korean, starving North Korean, munitions plant workers to produce new ammunition. But, the North Koreans benefit from that because they basically dump, like decades worth of elderly ammunition, which was simply going to, go to the point where it was useless. So they benefited from it. But everybody else basically didn't have a lot of elderly ammunition. Again, the voters and the democracy will not, sit for, spending a lot of money to pile up stockpiles. They were a little more willing to go with in building the production infrastructure that can quickly produce more, because that provides more jobs in peacetime, to build that infrastructure and to maintain it. And again, that's probably a lot more effective than trying to stockpile a lot of ammunition, because the ammunition, like I say, you can't update it. It basically goes bad after a while, and it becomes not useless, but less useful. So, we're relearning lessons we really learned, decades, half a century ago, as Rustin points out, in World War One. And hopefully it'll stick this time, but I wouldn't bet on it.
Austin, what about
there's some. I'm sorry.
So specifically, what about Iron?
I was going to enter.
The munitions, the missiles and like that for Iron Dome, is Israel going to keep up on that, especially if Hezbollah opens up from the north?
The United States produces most of those missiles, the Tamir missiles for Iron Dome. They were always from the United States. The United States produces a lot of stuff that Israel pays for. Or actually, we give them several $1 billion a year in grants for military equipment. So we pay for it, but they get to decide what they want. And they basically want more of these Tamir missiles because they don't make them. The United States makes them. And I don't know how long it's going to take them to get it. I think right now they've basically survived with some damage. The massive barrages of rockets that came out of Gaza. That was always the problem with Iron Dome. It's great in stopping small limited bombardments, but a massive bombardment, it was always understood, would overwhelm Iron Dome, and a lot of it would get through, and that's exactly what happened. There was some damage to ports like Ascalon, and even I think the larger ports further north, but not so much that the ports stopped operating. It discouraged a lot of foreign shipping from sending stuff in there. That created some problems. You had to unload the stuff somewhere else where an Israeli ship or a more daring shipper could move it to Israel. But that's the old, insurance risk problem. If you get a situation where the insurance rates for ships, skyrockets because there's more risk, that's another cost of war, and you have to take that into account. That's why we stockpiled a lot of munitions in Israel, because if they were going to have a crisis, you couldn't wait. You can't really fly in artillery ammunition. That stuff's heavy, and you got to ship it in. So we stockpiled it. But as it turned out, Israel had problems with Hamas, but they didn't need artillery. They needed, these small diameter bombs and anti-aircraft missiles, and that's easier to fly in. And all the artillery ammunition basically went north to Ukraine. So you got to be flexible. And again, you can't plan for every contingency, but if you have enough ammunition and ability to produce it available, on site, as it were, you have the kind of flexibility you need to basically cope, or at least cope better than the enemy with whatever you encounter. So far, Ukraine is doing pretty good compared to the Russians. The Russians have not; they have sanctions on them. They had limitations on what they can produce. As Austin pointed out, the NATO allies are getting their act together in terms of coordinating, manufacturing of ammunition, who supplies what, and of course the new NATO members, the ones that joined after 1991, they had a lot of 152 millimeter ammunition still sitting in there, and they sent that because, as Austin pointed out, the Ukrainians still have a lot of 152 millimeter guns, so they were able to use that stuff up. Of course, you got to remember that these guns, the artillery themselves, the barrels wear out after several thousand rounds. So, they were basically, it's a question of what's going to go first, your supply of ammunition or the barrel erosion on the guns themselves. I haven't heard much about that as a problem, but it is a problem. I don't know if it will become a critical problem. We'll have to wait and see.
But Jim, barrel life on some of the 155s, I would say most of the Western 155s manufactured in the last 20 years has been extended. So
Yes.
the same ultimately pumping rounds out. Yeah, you're going to wear the barrel down, and that's another logistics and definitely munitions delivery related problem. And that's I'd be interested in knowing or finding out how those old held out the Soviet era that the Ukrainians are using, most especially the others, they don't hold up well at all. But
Well, the Ukrainians had a lot of Soviet era 152 millimeter howitzers because they were basically the depot, as it were, the manufacturing center for a disproportionate amount of Russian weapons. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, they got to keep everything that was there. That was the deal. We're not going to shuffle around. Well, you would deserve that. You deserve that. So Ukraine kept a lot of old ammunition and old guns that can use them, and they're not putting these to good use. So, the Ukrainians had the right idea. They exported some stuff. They had some older tanks and T-72s and what have you, and they got one into the refurbishment and export business. But that was never that large, where it totally depleted their supplies, and it didn't really apply to ammunition because they were exporting this stuff to countries that were not involved in a major war, and if anything, they were just being used against rebels or what have you. So there was a lot of ammunition sitting around, waiting for a major war that nobody wanted to come along. And bingo, there it is. And there goes the ammunition. So that solves one problem, because both sides are going to eventually run out of this artillery ammunition. And it is happening to both sides. And this sort of slows things down, like Austin pointed out, it did in World War I. If you haven't got a lot of ammo, you're not going to move that front line. In fact, in many parts of Ukraine, you have a World War I style front line where nobody has the ability, nobody has the munitions to launch an effective offensive. And that is literally the reason why a lot of the front line, the Ukrainian offensives aren't moving, because they don't have enough ammunition to basically pave the way for the advance. I mean, one way to clear a minefield is basically plow it up with artillery fire. Bingo, there go the mines. Of course, there goes mobility, but because you got all those, craters. But, that's the way war is. It provides opportunities, but it also provides more obstacles.
Well, we'll wrap it up there for today.
and I was going to.
Oh, do you have something, Austin?
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment more relevant earlier when Jim was talking about, the citizens saying we don't want to pay for this. There's peace breaking out, and we got enough ammo, and it just sits there and does nothing. No, because the failure to realize that it's there as a deterrence deterrence factor, and you have to have a war break out to see why you had it. I recall, and I'm not going to take a shot at the names of these two places, but I know that after about 1995, and it ends with 9/11, at least two major arsenals, areas that we were storing ammunition for during the Cold War, that were under a lot of pressure to be closed down. First of all, we don't feel that quote unquote environmental issues, even though it's minor compared to what you would encounter in other areas, because you have to keep the bunkers, the shell bunkers so far apart, and then you've got to be able to have the temperature controlled and the like. And I know one of them got shut down. Now, here it's been getting on almost 30 years later, but that's another example of what Jim's talking about, saying, oh, well, we aren't going to need these. It's peace, and we're moving to quote unquote more modern systems, and you find out that with some of the advances in artillery shells, also the artillery fire direction systems and target acquisition systems, these are absolutely primo weapons for the 21st century. And then I guess the last comment I was going to make is that you've also got to think now about missiles, because missile expenditure rate can be very, very high, and they are hard to replace and to resupply, especially in ships at sea. That is a problem to provide ships at sea with new guided munitions. But I guess that's a subject for another podcast.
All right, we'll wrap it up there, and we will talk to you gentlemen next time.
Okay, see you then.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.